Right. Thanks, Bill. No, I didn't blow dry it and brush it, but we did have to catch a couple to get photographs. Can everyone hear me all right in here? Yeah, great. Hopefully Betsy can hear us online. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the more than 20 Indigenous groups whose land we do this flying fox work on in the wet tropics, and also my co-authors who are out there running around in the field quite a lot at the moment collecting data. And two of those, Renee and Nikita, are both traditional owners of country in the wet tropics as well. So it's nice to have them working on the projects with us. Terrain is actually undertaking quite a bit of work on spectacle flying foxes at the moment, and all of that's funded by the Australian government. And today, and a lot of that work, we're collaborating strongly with JCU and various people in JCU. And today, I'm looking forward to showing you a little bit of the work that we're not collaborating so strongly on in JCU with, but maybe we will in the future. There's some interesting analysis that I need some help with. So I'll just start by reminding everyone a little bit about the flying fox. You probably already know most of this. They're distributed from eastern Indonesia through New Guinea, Cape York, and the wet tropics. Some work done by Sam Fox from JCU quite a long time ago now. Genetic work showed that they do move between New Guinea and the wet tropics and Cape York and New Guinea. So there is enough gene flow there to show that there's stratification in the genetics between those populations, but there's enough movement to show that they do cross over. But something that's important to us to understand is that there's not so much movement that you can't tell what the wet tropics population is doing as a subpopulation. So the movements are quite constrained, but they do happen. So we're focused on the wet tropics region where the flying fox is at its most abundant in Australia. And our sister organisation, Cape York NRM, is also working on the species in Cape York, mostly trying to figure out where they are, where their camps are and where they're foraging, so we can see whether there's any conservation interventions we might be able to put in place there. And again, they're working very strongly with the traditional owners of country up there. So one of the reasons they're a priority to the federal government, that's a little bit out of whack now, but anyway, sorry about that. CSIRO data demonstrated a roughly 80% decline over 15 to 20 year period. The data in the graph there from Westcott 2015 doesn't include 23,000 bats that died in a heat wave in 2019. So there are, but what it does show that cyclones are also impacting the population, and the decline is driven by events like cyclones, heat waves, and tick mortality. It's also worth noting that they're endangered at the global scale. So in New Guinea as well, they're considered endangered, and in eastern Indonesia with different sets of pressures. Ecologically, they're pretty important in our tropical rainforests. They have two important modes of seed dispersal, one by carrying fruit in the mouth, just carrying it a short distance away from the parent tree to feed and drop the seed if it's a big seeded thing. And if it's a small seeded fruit like a fig, then although they spit out 95% of the seeds, those 5% that go through the gut can get dispersed over 100 kilometers. They're very big flies and their gut passage rate can be quite slow. So there's not many other fruit-eating animals that will disperse over those distances. There are a few. Things like channel-bill cuckoos, which also eat a lot of fig, can move those distances just as easily. It's also a pollinator. Less is known about their effectiveness as a pollinator. Some of the work that's been done with flying foxes in other places has shown that they also eat a lot of the flowers that they get the nectar from. So they don't actually effectively leave behind a living pollinated flower, but they do get pollen all over their fur and they move to other trees. So they do a service. We're just not sure how effective it is compared to some of the birds. It's one of the top 110 priority species in the country that the federal government has listed, and that's why the funding is coming to do some stuff about them. In the past, their decline was driven by land clearing and then persecution, both at fruit orchards, where it was actually legal to shoot them, and you could still get permits to shoot them up until 2 years ago. And some fruit orchardists put in place electric grids above their fruit trees, and the bats got electrocuted as they came down. That caused a lot of deaths, and the Environmental Defender's Office took the government to court over that and got it banned, which was a really good thing. And persecution in camps in this urban areas is also still an active problem. But all of those factors are a little bit historical now and less important. What we're mostly dealing with now is climate change. Heat waves is the big one, but also more severe cyclones is likely to have a big impact in future. And tick paralysis is a pervasive issue that's going on for the species. So I'm going to talk about two components of our program, one of them looking at the tick paralysis problem. Kills a lot of bats every year, and it's a constant mortality that a species trying to recover from a decline is better off without, so we're trying to reduce that. So Solanum mauritianum is a wild tobacco bush, was introduced in 1946 to Australia, to the Atherton tablelands, and it's a bat-adapted plant, so it presents its fruit vertically, easy for bats to come and land on. Its nutrition content is good for bats, and it was introduced specifically to attract spectacled flying foxes away from fruit orchards. It worked, but what we didn't realise is that it was also going to cause problems for the bats to get ticks. Veterinary evidence from tick-infected bats demonstrates that they have absolutely zero immunity to ticks. They're not a natural host of ticks. Most of our native wildlife can tolerate the saliva of this tick, like bandicoots and pythons and things, just get it and they don't die and don't get affected, but bats didn't used to come in contact with it. So that was a hypothesis we developed in the early 2000s. So we went out to test that. We underwent nearly 2,400 mock bat feeding events on tobacco bushes. So we had a little wheat bag the weight of a bat. We had a little bit of dry ice to produce carbon dioxide. We draped a flannel over that, and we left that little unit draped over the fruit of the bush for the length of time that a bat would normally forage. It's between 5 and 15 minutes on one cluster. 0.4% of those feeding bouts, mock feeding bouts, picked up ticks. And it showed that it's where the bats probably pick up most of their ticks. The other thing we'd done prior to that was looked at seed rain under bat camps and demonstrated that there was a lot of tobacco seed coming through the bats into their camps. So we knew they fed on the tobacco bush a lot. The tick season lasts about 90 days each year, and it happens to coincide when the mothers are giving birth to young. So if we look at a camp like the Peterson Creek camp, which last November had nearly 15,000 bats in it, using those proportions, we estimated that about 5,000 bats would be killed by ticks if every single bat foraged on a tobacco bush every single night. The reality was that we got 1,152 dead bats last tick season, which suggests that 1 in 5 bats might forage on a tobacco bush every night. That's if every bat returns to the camp to die. There may be bats dying out in the field that we don't pick up. So this is minimum numbers of dead bats in a year for the tobacco bush or the ticks that are picked up. There are some other Solanum introduced, like Torvum, and there might be cherry guavas and things that would also bring bats down low enough to get in contact with ticks. The ticks can't quest very high, so the bats need to go low to get them. So it's a significant ongoing mortality we want to deal with. This is some of the consequences of that. The bats are paralysed within 24 hours of a tick bite, and the mother, and quite often, and they die basically. If they're caught early enough, they can be given anti-venines for the tick paralysis and be treated, but only a very small proportion of treated bats survive. So because we had 1,152 lost bats last year, adults, there were 332 orphans that were picked up and reared by Tolga Bat Hospital. I'll just mention that Tolga Bat Hospital also helps collect all the data on the mortality, so we're paying staff to do that with them. And those 330 young were reared through and released. This just shows the peak, or the incidence of tick mortality in the bats through the season last year. Most of the births occur October, November. So it really is when the mothers have got very dependent young. So it has a bit of a double effect. Some of those mothers die and their young starve, or they fall into a creek, like at Peterson Creek. There were a lot of dead bats in the creek. The babies quickly drown. So there's more loss from the mothers getting impacted. So there's the justification to try and get rid of wild tobacco bush. So to do that, we looked at the area where bats are affected by ticks, and it's pretty well restricted to the Atherton tablelands. There's the occasional one turns up on the coast, and they probably picked up the tick on the tablelands and flew down. And that's partly because that's the highest density of tobacco bush, but the bats culturally are used to feeding on tobacco up there. So we mapped a 1,000 square kilometre area, and we ran some satellite imagery over that. And there's a few bits of information about the satellite imagery for anyone interested. It took us, last year was a very cloudy year, put it that way. We got 4 runs, and finally by July we were supposed to do this in April or May, but it was cloudy the whole time. So what we did was we set up, we had a company called GeoImage Australia do this work for us. They developed a model to identify the tobacco bush from that satellite data. We went out and gave them locations where the tobacco bushes were, and then they developed a model. We basically had 13 different classes of vegetation that they would map. One of those was wild tobacco. On the left there, you can see the wild tobacco bush has got a fairly big leaf. It's quite hairy. It's got quite a silvery appearance from the air. The 2 photos in the middle of those frames, you can see the silvery bushes in here and in around here. That's the wild tobacco bush. And it's easily identifiable even from that blurry satellite imagery. So GeoImage Australia developed this model. All the different shades of green and other colours are other vegetation types, but the red is the wild tobacco layer that they predicted. We then took that single layer of vegetation and put it into our ArcGIS system and coloured it yellow instead of red. So this is just a snapshot of part of the tablelands, and we developed a weed management plan so that our contractors could work to that. If we just focus in on a little bit of the landscape there, where there's that linear feature, the image at the top is the satellite imagery and the predicted locations of tobacco bush. Below that is higher resolution. Whoops, wrong one. This is the predicted linear feature that we looked at earlier, and this is the aerial photography, and you can see all these silvery crowns. That is actually a lot of tobacco bush in an abandoned or an unused road reserve. So the prediction's pretty good. There's also some patches in the paddocks here predicted by the model, but up here there's a whole lot of patches of very old Guinea grass, which has gone a bit silvery, which was also predicted by the model to be tobacco bush. So we went out and did quite a lot of ground truthing. It was quite quick and easy to drive around to where that was predicted to be tobacco bush and just put a polygon around the bit that wasn't and delete it from the layer in ArcGIS. So we then feed that information along with where are the bat camps, where are the bats most likely to be feeding, where are there other threatened ecosystems and things that might benefit from this intervention. And we can give that to our weed management contractors to direct them on where to go to get the weeds. A couple of other little issues that arise as part of this is most of the farms that were heavily infested were absentee landlords. So it was really hard to figure out who and how to get in touch to get access to the land to start removing the weed. Most farmers did a good job of keeping it down. It was on roadsides, areas that weren't used, fragments, edges, things like that. And in the past, people doing revegetation used to use wild tobacco bush as a shelter crop for the young rainforest seedlings. And we've been talking to all of those people and asking them not to use that because of its impacts on spectacle flying fox. And everyone's been very happy to stop doing that. So getting out there and killing the bush. We have a very strong partnership with the Tablelands Regional Council to do this. As part of working this up, we got them to put wild tobacco bush into their biosecurity plan for their regional council. And they were able to do that because of its impact on a threatened species, both listed both state and nationally. That opened up additional funding so that they were contracted by Main Roads. Because they had the weed listed in their biosecurity plan, Main Roads were able to fund them both through the threatened species stream of funding that they have, but also through the biosecurity plan funding. So now Main Roads are funding Tableland Regional Council to clean the main roads. We're funding them to clean all of their non-main roads. We also developed a mapping portal so that as they go and do the work, some of that is cutting and pasting, as you see here. They record everything they do on a phone app as they go in the field. And they're able to work both on private land and on council land. We also have a partnership with some traditional owner groups. Tableland Yidinji are joining Tableland Regional Council in this effort, and Najanji also, we've just contracted them to supply an employee to that same team. So that team will work across everyone's country where the bats are most affected. And we're also hoping to get Jitterbul and Mamu on board in the near future. So this is a little bit of output from the app that we have the council using. The yellow, again, is the wild tobacco distribution, and the blue dots are where the council has gone out and killed it. So they just record it as they go. For each of those dots, it has a whole lot of data surrounding it. So they don't all represent a single bush. They might represent a patch where they killed 5 or 10, and that's all recorded there in the data. So you can see they're getting around. An example of that is they might have a single dot which shows these group of bushes along the roadside, which they've gone ahead and cut and pasted, and that'll be one record, but it'll show us that there's 5 there. In the middle there, you can see a banner that we've had at various agricultural shows and things so that we can get landholders and farmers interested, let them know that we're able to come on and kill their tobacco. It's very toxic to cattle, so they're quite happy for us to do that. So up until the end of June this year, we've tested that weed control strategy. It's working quite well. The image there shows where Tablelands Regional Council have been working and getting tobacco bushes killed. If we focus in on the area where they're looking at the tobacco, it's about 14 hectares, 131 kilometres of road, nearly 4,000 tobacco bushes killed by the end of June. And there's been more since then, which I just haven't got the numbers on. And this program is running until the end of till June 2028. So we've got a few more years to keep knocking the weed back as much as we can and getting the community on board to support that suppression and keep it suppressed. And at the same time, Tolga Bat Hospital are monitoring tick mortality for us. So we might end up with a nice correlation if we're lucky but at this early stage, it's hard to tell. We're about to go into the next season and the next phase now. So that was stage one, and I don't have access to the time, so better let me know if I'm running slow. Yeah. So one of the other components of work we're doing is looking at bat camps. And as most of you would know, flying foxes congregate in camps to roost. This work by CSIRO, radio tracking bats, demonstrates that from about October, November through until March, they're in their largest, most stable camps. It's when the mothers are giving birth. They start crashing in those camps, and then they go into a mating season at the end of that period. The rest of the year, the camps break up. There's a lot more movement between camps by individual bats, and they might occupy smaller camps and be all over the landscape, much harder to count. So we're suggesting that some of these camp locations are a very important resource for the bats that we need to protect so that they can be cared for into the long term. The image in the middle here is one of Emmeline Norris's images from a thermal drone. Another part of the work that we're heavily involved with JCU in is developing a new method of counting them using thermal imagery, which is going very well. So the camps themselves, the image there is a Tully Falls Road camp, the thermal image on private land, which is currently for sale if anyone wants to buy a bat camp. So what we wanted to do, we have a database that Noel Priest started putting together from lots of different sources, collated it from all over the place. And it has something like 300 and something records of flying fox camps in the wet tropics and beyond. We've narrowed that down to 176 camps that are verified camps of substantial size. So we thought, okay, let's pick the top 40 camps and go and look at whether there's any interventions we can do that will help protect those camps for the long term. So to figure that out, we had to go through a process of prioritizing which camps to choose. So we looked at camp occupancy parameters. So how often, like how many checks were done on a particular camp and what proportion of those checks was the camp occupied? How many bats are using a particular camp? Is it a big camp? Is it always a little camp? How many years has that camp been known to be used for? And whether or not it fits the criteria for a nationally important camp. We also look at tenure. And by the way, only 7% of flying fox camps are in protected area of national park or World Heritage Area. So they don't like going into protected areas as far as we know. So tenure might be partially protected or completely insecure. We look at the vegetation, whether it's a remnant, whether it's an endangered regional ecosystem, and the extent of that vegetation that's protected across the state. So we can start targeting where's a good place to do work with multiple benefits. And then we also looked at Indigenous interests in those areas. So we scored and weighted 176 camps, and I'm not expecting you to read all that. We'll just look at this one. So firstly, if we have a look at that camp's been checked 128 times to see if it was occupied, and it was occupied 25 of those checks. It could have numbers ranging from 50 to 47,000. So sometimes it's a really big camp. It's known to have been occupied for 28 years. So it's quite a long-term camp, but it's only been occupied in 10 of those 28 years. So they come and go from it from time to time. Its tenure is freehold, so it's probably not very secure. It's in an endangered ecosystem that's listed under the Vegetation Management Act, so that's a VMA status. Its biodiversity status is also endangered, and sometimes both of those are in the Queensland legislation, but sometimes they're different to one another. It doesn't have any Indigenous interests over that particular parcel of land. But it scores quite highly, and we can weight those scores. To us, the most important thing we might consider is it insecure land, tenure, that we can try and protect? Because it's a long-term camp, it's probably worth making that attempt. So we would score that reasonably highly as something we would work on. If you wanted to score it for a different reason, you might score it low because it's insecure. You might score the protected ones higher. But for our purposes, we want to just make decisions about where to invest some interventions. That's the way we're doing it. So then we went to look at these 40 camps, the top 40, and after we'd scored them all, to look at whether there was anything useful we can do in any of those camps. So things we had to consider is that camp sizes and shapes are really variable in both space and time. So a lot of the nationally accepted monitoring or measuring protocols rely on a 1 hectare plot. Putting a 1 hectare plot into a bat camp that moves in space and is there and not there at different times, it's probably too much work. So we opted not to do a big investment like that, just because of the nature of the camps. We also had to consider how complex tropical vegetation is. Normally, Australian government funded is tied to the Environmental Monitoring Systems Australia methods, which are quite detailed, and we have to collect specimens of every single species on a plot. And we have to identify them and lodge specimens in the herbaria. That didn't seem practical for this sort of purpose, even though it would have been nice to do. So we've ended up doing a completely bespoke method, ignoring all of the federal systems that have been developed for this sort of thing. And we were given permission to do that, of course. And because it's not actually monitoring plots, it wasn't really that important to use the tried and true proven monitoring methods. So what we ended up with for each camp, we'd have a look at 3 10 by 10 meter plots, quick and easy to install. And it gave us some measures on vegetation condition that we could refer back to. So we'd look at life forms, whether it was trees or vines or shrubs, whatever, all the age classes in each life form. We'd measure ground cover, litter depth, litter cover, as well as logs and rocks and things like that. And then we also measured canopy disturbance using an index that had been developed previously. And at each camp, over the entire camp and in the surrounding neighbourhood, we would look at edge effects, soil disturbance, weeds, feral animals, fire, human disturbance, and any other disturbances or things that we might consider would threaten the camp. And we measured those. And those we just scored on a severity scale for each camp. So if we look at, have a quick look at some of the data, this is the mean scores for each of those threats that we looked at across 40 camps. So the weed invasion came out as a significant threat across all those camps. So it's a pretty important one for us to look at. Edge effects was surprisingly high. There's a lot of those camps in narrow fragments, small fragments, linear fragments, or in suburbs. So there's a lot of edge effects impacting them. Human disturbance, of course, was high. There were a couple of camps where soil disturbance by pigs in particular was pretty important. And then lots of barking dogs. So if we look at weeds, this is at a camp in Port Douglas. In this photo, this is the Crees Creek camp. That's the sort of understory you would expect to see in that vegetation type. That's healthy, it's recruiting, it's got the right seedling mix in there. This is what it was like over half the understory of that camp. It's a massive invasion of heliconia in particular from the neighbouring resort, which is moving vegetatively into that swamp, shading out seedlings probably, probably reducing some of the normal seed dispersal processes, but also imposing a lot of root competition on any young plants growing. So the expectations there is that as cyclones come through every now and then, knock out the canopy trees, the dense weed invasion will suppress the right recovery and recruitment. It'll slow it down. And in the long term, we expect a significant vegetation change there, and it may no longer be suitable for bats. Simple solution, let's go in and kill all the heliconia. And educate the community about this garden escapees, managing that into the future. Same camp. It's mixed tenure, which many of them are, and I'll talk about that. You can see there in this, whoops, wrong one, in this image, that very open edge, sea breeze coming through there, drying, lots of wind penetration and also, you know, wind penetration during storms helping to blow canopy trees over, which is like the bats like to live in, roost in. And active clearing. During the time we were measuring these 40 camps, 2 of them had significant clearing in the camps, even though they're a nationally listed species that has to be referred, self-referred to the EPBC Act and the Nature Conservation Act in the state. Those referrals didn't happen. One of the camps, all of the trees were entirely cleared. Both of those events have been reported to both state and federal authorities, and they're working through a process to figure out what to do about it. So some of these threats are significant. Now, this data is all quite fresh, and I haven't done any in-depth analysis, so we're just exploring it at this stage. What you can see here is across those 40 sites, the number of seedlings, sapling, average number of seedlings, saplings, small mature and large mature trees only, the only life form in this graph, in those averaged across the 3 plots in each camp. You expect to see a lot more seedlings than saplings, more saplings than small mature, and more small mature than large mature trees. And a lot of those camps are showing that healthy trend of regeneration of their forest type. Some of them are a bit abnormal. So those are the ones that we think are worth investigating. What's going on where you've got more saplings than seedlings? Is it just a big recruitment event at that one time because of a fire or something, or what's going on? So we went and had a look at some of those. If we just take one example and look at Tolga scrub, which is a very long-term, thank you, that'd be lovely, a long-term bat camp on the Atherton Tablelands, which is a large maternity camp. Now, it has few seedlings and saplings, more small mature trees, and these are trees quite big. And you'd wonder why there's so few in a Mojave rainforest. The reason is that it's completely infested with paddy melons, a native rainforest wallaby. If we looked at the leaf litter measure, you find all of our leaf litter measure depths is 0. There's no leaf litter. The paddy melons are eating every leaf as it falls and eating most of the seedlings that aren't too toxic. So it's completely suppressing the regeneration of this forest type. One of the reasons is that it's a long, narrow, linear strip surrounded by grass and grassy fields. Paddy melons, 50% of their diet is rainforest leaves, 50% is grass. During the day, they forage in the rainforest. At night, they come out and graze on the grasses around the edges. It's highly nutritious basalt soil. So the paddy melon population is just berserk. And they're causing problems for the bat camp, in my opinion. So what to do about this sort of thing? And this is where all of this work is leading. What's a practical intervention that's going to help? This particular fragment is variously occupied by the bats. Sometimes they cover an area like that. Sometimes just a narrow strip of it. Recently, they were in those 2 patches, and at the moment, they're in those 2 patches. When the little red flying foxes come in, they occupy the entire area of rainforest that you can see there all the way down to the tip. and there'll be 1 million or so little red flying foxes, sometimes more. It's first recognised as a camp in 1990 by Jenny McLean, and she's been monitoring and working on that camp for a very long time. So there's a lot of good data for this camp. So it has very severe edge effects as well. Quite a lot of the big canopy trees have been knocked out by previous cyclones, but then those species aren't regenerating because the pademelons are eating them. So I think the vegetation is in a steady decline. And as those big open canopy trees drop out of the system, it's going to become less and less favourable for flying foxes. So it's probably one that we should do something about. To the Tableland Yidinji people, there are grave sites in there, there are artefacts. It's a really important cultural area for them. And as I mentioned, Tolgabat Hospital have done a lot of work. So our plan that we're slowly developing for this site is to work with Council, Yidinji, and any others that want to join in to develop a good solid management plan for the fragment, focusing on recruitment of canopy trees, fencing areas out, keep the pademelons out, let the trees regrow in canopy gaps, plant some buffers along the edges to minimise edge effects, hopefully buffer it against cyclones, constrain human movement. There's quite a lot of rubbish gets in there. A lot of people get in there and camp and disturb the bats. So if we can constrain that by putting in good boardwalks, good walking tracks, showing the world the bats and the forest, but keeping it controlled so that it's less disturbing, that would be good. And then there's an industrial estate next door, and there's a caravan park. So it's a good opportunity to let the neighbours know how to look after the bats and how to look after the edge of the forest. So that's one example of where this is all going. The last one, how's my timing? Shall I go into this one? In Yungaburra, another village on the Atherton Tablelands, the Spectacle Flying Fox Camp occupied about that footprint last November when they were having babies and dying from ticks. It's across 7 land parcels, 3 different land tenures. And we needed to get permissions from 5 different landholders to do any work in there. And just as an aside, we also had to get an 8th landholder to launch the drones from for the drone work when we did that. Within that camp area, there's active subdivisions going on. There's active clearing as well. And there's houses being built underneath parts of it. There's also a very active land care group caring for the forest along the water resource reserves and the road reserves. They put in botanical walks, there's walking tracks, they put in signage. Tolgabat Hospital also works there. And a lot of tour guides come there because it's easy to see platypus and tree kangaroos. So it's a good opportunity for us, I think. The understory is being invaded by camphor laurel. In the long term, that's probably going to outcompete eucalypts. It'll shade out their seedlings. It's very hard to get fire in there now because of the neighbouring suburbs. So we probably have to manage that eucalypt canopy physically by hand. Removing the camphor laurel is one way to start doing that. There's quite a few other weeds that we could control in there. The bats keep bringing them in, like tobacco bush. So I think it's the sort of place where active weed management will help, and that because the land care group has been there for so long, if we can give them a kickstart, knock the camphor laurel down, knock the other weeds down for them, they might be able to continue the management. There's also opportunities for a bit of buffer planting around the edges with revegetation, and a lot of opportunities for community awareness and helping the tour guides to talk to their guests about the issues in the bats and stuff as well. So economic opportunities there. And some of those tour guides have their guests go to the restaurants locally. So if we can kind of turn that into how to manage a camp in a suburb and look at those opportunities, then that hopefully will come out as a good model. But of course, there's a lot of opposition to the fact that the bats are there and noisy and smelly. And pooing on people's cars. But it's it's all looking good, and there's a lot more to do, and there's a lot more depth in the data that we've been collecting to look at further. So if there's, oh, that's all the different tenures. I forgot to throw that up. Any questions?
Very good, Andrew. Thank you. Very clear, very interesting talk. Any questions?
Hi, Andrew. I've got two, if I could. At the start, you said that the flying foxes were endangered in New Guinea. Why is that, considering it was such a remote area? And then the second one, what makes the tobacco bush such a good host for the paralysis ticks?
So the first one, the IUCN has gone through their assessment process. And I can't remember the exact criteria they used to assess them as endangered globally. But there's a lot of hunting and eating of flying foxes in New Guinea and Indonesia. And I expect that that's probably the main driver of the issue to have them listed as endangered there. But there's also active clearing and logging going on in their habitats in New Guinea. So it's been done by an bat expert megachiropteran panel with the IUCN, involving experts from the Pacific and Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as Australia. So it's quite a rigorous process. The other one was that, well, funny you should say tobacco is a good host for the ticks. There's anecdotal evidence from the people on the tablelands who manage weeds. They say they hate working in wild tobacco because they always get lots of ticks. But what we've found with our sampling, where tobacco is associated with guinea grass, basically when a tick is questing for a host, they need to stay in a high humidity area, a low wind. So they won't quest very high, normally below 1.2 meters. But if you've got tobacco bush in amongst guinea grass, it's suppressing the wind, the humidity is high, the ticks can quest a bit higher. And when the bat lands on the bush, it sags a bit lower. So they're brought down in contact with grass. But the tobacco bush is also a bit hairy, so it's retaining humidity around the leaves and the trunk. So it's all to do with tick biology that, and the bats coming down and associated with that dense lower story where the ticks are.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. That was a very interesting presentation. I was wondering, I've heard that the flying foxes can also get birth deformities from the tobacco bush. Is that true? And also, do the bats travel between PNG and Australia, or do they stay in their own countries?
Yeah. Second question, yes, they do travel from New Guinea to Australia. Just occasionally, there's gene flow is measurable. The birth deformities, I presume you're talking about the cleft palate syndrome. It's unclear what the source of that deformity is. Lee McMichael, a vet from University of Queensland's been working with Jenny for some time, has been investigating that. She thinks it's an introduction of some sort of chemical in the third trimester of pregnancy that would cause those deformities. Wild tobacco bush is not ripe at that time. So it's unlikely, unless they're coming and eating some of the green fruit, where the chemical levels will be higher, then that might come from tobacco, but it's more likely to be something else. But it's also linked to a gene abnormality, or whether it's an abnormality, but a gene precursor makes certain individuals susceptible to cleft palate syndrome with a chemical thrown on top of it. So people have been working on that and trying to get to the bottom of it. As far as mortality goes, this last November, we had 37 cleft palate. Was it 37? Do you remember? It was the biggest year ever, where there was 37. I'll have to check with Jenny on that. Quite a lot of cleft palate, but it pales into insignificant compared to the tick deaths, which is over 1,000. Yeah.
Other questions? Yep.
Thank you. I didn't know that ticks could be that nasty to flying foxes. We have got a number of flying foxes, a small number of flying foxes in the back garden in a powder puff. And we noticed that in the last few years, the number of ticks that we collect on our body every time we work in the garden has gone up quite nastily. Is there a reason for it? Any idea, perhaps?
There probably is a reason, but it's probably not associated with the bats.
Nothing to do with it.
If the bats had the ticks, they'd be dead. But maybe you've got extra bandicoots because you're doing such a good job gardening. Bandicoots moving and they'll bring more ticks. Sorry.
Hello. As far as weed control, is wild tobacco a pretty easy plant to get rid of, or does it tend to regrow and be a pain?
It's pretty easy. It's the bigger plants, it's easy to cut and paste a chemical on the stump, and that kills them completely. When our contractors are doing that work, as if there's fruit on the tree, the fruit's all cut off and bagged, taken away so that there's no seed bank. One of the other good characteristics of wild tobacco, the little bit of work that's been done suggests that they only have a 2-year soil seed life. So if we can keep them suppressed for 4 years, the seed bank is going to drop out or diminish considerably. Small plants are easy to kill with foliar spray. So as far as a model weed control goes, it's actually quite an easy one once you can get on top of it, I think. And that seed longevity in the soil is short enough to make it feasible to try spend the money to do something like this. So if anyone from the herbarium wants to do some more testing on seed longevity in the soil of wild tobacco bush, I'd be appreciative.
Would they be able to build up an immunity, and how long would it take to the tick paralysis?
That's kind of an evolutionary time that to build up an immunity. I think it would take many, many generations, and I wouldn't like to guess how many. Yeah, it's not something to wait for because they've been in Australia with ticks for 3 million years, megabats, I think. But Darren had a question.
Getting my exercise. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. That was I'm not going to bite about the herbarium, doing the seed biology
I
thing.
thought you were going to offer.
Fascinating. Look, a couple of questions. One of which was answered actually. So I've got one question remaining. How do you know that a bat has died from paralysis, tick paralysis, as opposed to a natural mortality? Is it really obvious?
Yes. So Jenny has been collecting every dead bat from these camps for about 30 years. And vet schools, several vet schools have been working with her, autopsying every bat, understanding the signs and symptoms of tick paralysis is really advanced. And basically in the end, their heart muscle, they can't breathe anymore and their heart stops. And that's often within 24 hours. But they have a progression of signs and symptoms. And on autopsy, it's fairly obvious what's gone on. And all of the bats are generally, each individual bat that's picked up at a camp, the ticks found on the bat, and that's all recorded too. Sometimes there's more than one tick.
They're very tiny though, the ticks, aren't they?
Oh,
No?
an adult shellback tick is substantial and easy enough to find.
Maybe the crater as well, where the
Yeah.
white is,
Yeah,
Right.
you can tell.
yeah.
I'm a botanist, so no.
We'll forgive you.
Questions online? Any questions? Dennis, I just wanted to ask, or Andrew, So it seems like you have a pretty good idea of where the ticks are foraging, and you mentioned that up to like 1.2 meters or so. So has you or someone sampled up into the three-dimensional aspects of the canopy with some kind of a lure to see whether you're getting any ticks up high like that?
We haven't done that work, but it had been done previously. Back in the early 2000s, when we sampled the tobacco bush, we went up to 1.8 meters. And it was only in the mid to lower levels of sampling that we got the ticks. But there was literature that I'd looked into that basically said ticks don't quest up trees.
Okay.
So arboreal animals, unless they come to the ground, they don't tend to have ticks. So I just relied on that past literature.
What is it about cyclones that disturbs the bats?
There's several things. They do knock out the canopy trees that they like to roost in. We're noticing from our data that and this is a working hypothesis that maybe Ali or someone will investigate one day, they tend to like open canopied trees, which are often a little bit emergent and higher than the others. And they're commonly ones that get knocked out by cyclones. But the biggest impact is probably the post-cyclone famine. So the cyclones strip the leaves, fruit, flowers off the trees. So for many months after a cyclone, all those trees are doing is regrowing leaves. They're not producing fruit or flowers, so there's not as much to eat. Flying foxes, being quite capable of flying, can often move to another area to feed, and so they move out of the area of impact of the cyclones. But as cyclones get bigger and more intense, the footprint of damage is bigger. So it's really that famine for 8 or 10 months after a cyclone that's having an impact, and it might suppress reproduction. Fewer individuals might be able to reproduce when they're all crammed into the remaining resources.
I can probably add to that. Up in the Daintree after Jasper, the trees didn't seed for probably nearly 12 months. And also the loss of the flowers and the seeds, an innumerable number of birds just died, gone. And it was virtually 11 to 12 months after the seeds started to fall again, but some of the trees still haven't produced seeds from 2 years ago.
It's a big impact that we need to get a better handle on.
Any other questions? A lot of questions. Guess not. Andrew, thank you very much. Really a superbly interesting talk. Very well presented. Thanks a lot.